It has been said that cars are the dominant species on the planet by many urban developers and those interested in city planning, and that's by no surprise. We live in a car-centric capitalistic society that promotes this isolationist transportation trap. But back in the 1940s and 50s, as America's economy was booming after World War II, car production, along with the highway system, began to rise, and it was the norm to own your own car. Also, during the 1940s and 50s, after the atomic bomb had dropped and the space race began, both the atomic and space ages in American pop culture also began. These affected not only the way that cars were being designed to reflect the spacecraft that was being made by NASA, and a futurist design that was seen in cartoons such as the Jetsons, it also reflected the architecture of many buildings. After all, now that everyone has their own cars, who can see those small signs downtown? These tall structures of what looked to be colorful, lit-up wings of an aircraft or shining stars from the sky, or upside-down roofing, made the buildings themselves look like they were hanging from the sky. This by no means was a subtle design, if the name of the style, Googie, doesn't already give that impression. And that's because they were made to grab the attention of cars passing by. But I think the importance of this style is not only from America's obsession with space, but where that obsession comes from. During the 1960s, America was already decades into the Cold War against communism after the Russian Revolution in 1917. By 1957, the Soviet Union had not only already been established, but launched Sputnik, the first man-made object to be launched into orbit. This spurred the space race, and the Apollo missions quickly began in the United States to try and save face. In 1959, the Cuban Revolution led to tensions between the United States and the new Marxist Cuba, and when John F. Kennedy was elected into office, he was quickly humiliated due to the failure of the Bay of Pigs invasion. Now, the United States wanted to continue to preserve their facade and naively try to prove that capitalism could prevail. The Seattle World's Fair seemed to be the perfect place to do this. It was originally a concept for a 1955 luncheon, which got pushed to 1962 as the space race was beginning to pick up. And as Cuba had just revolutionized to a leftist government, communism was prevailing, and the United States needed to prove to Americans that they were not behind the Soviet Union in the realms of science and space. While it was considered a world fair, the Soviet Union was the only socialist country to have ever been formally invited, even though they declined. China, North Korea, Vietnam, and Cuba were not invited, however. Edward Carlson sketched out an idea for the Space Needle on a napkin, conceptualizing it as a balloon tethered to the ground, and John Graham had a concept of a flying saucer for the main observation deck. Victor Steinbruch introduced an hourglass profile to the tower, all three of these features being heavily influenced by Googie architecture, most notably the flying saucer at the top. And this was a large feat. The needle cost $4.5 billion to build, and was built to withstand 200-mile-per-hour winds, which was twice as much as the legal requirement at the time, and earthquakes of 9.0 magnitude. And it worked. In 1965, a 6.5 magnitude earthquake shook Seattle, but only broke a bottle of champagne. The observation deck also had a revolving glass floor where the three of the only restaurants it's ever housed were located. It had a large engine that only ran at 1 horsepower, meaning that there was an entire rotation every 45 minutes. Towering at 605 feet, it was the largest man-made structure west of the Mississippi at the time, and despite its large stature, it only took 400 days to complete the entire construction of the needle. It was also built in tandem with the Seattle Central Monorail. Plans were being made in 1910, but never realized until 1955 when the World's Fair began its planning stages. The World's Fair itself was a huge deal at the time, showcasing exhibits of science, commerce and industry, artwork, entertainment such as opera, and even had Elvis Presley acting in the 1963 film It Happened at the World's Fair. It also included a World of Tomorrow exhibit that showcased electrical power and automobiles, but thankfully also showcased the monorail. The World's Fair, though planned to be a showcase of the technological advancements of the United States in contrast to the Soviet Union, quickly became a spectacle of 1960s Western culture. You had Elvis Presley, Nat King Cole, Ella Fitzgerald, Kurt Russell, Francis Bacon, Walt Disney, astronaut John Glenn, just to name a few of the attendants. But while the spectacle of the 1960s glamour was going on, there was one person who was not present. President Kennedy was dealing with the Cuban Missile Crisis, where Cuba was receiving arms from the USSR in order to arm themselves in case of another imperialist attack, such as the Bay of Pigs. And I think that emphasizes the meaning of what the Space Needle really was. The World's Fair was actually a showcase of the powers of capitalism. After all, the United States was still losing the space race, and they would spend almost twice as much as what the USSR had spent on all of their ventures combined just to send 3 astronauts to the moon once. A reckless use of money meant to prove the communists wrong, as racial discrimination, workers' rights violations, and economic disparity was thriving in the heart of capitalism and corporatism, much of which was scarce to find at its Soviet counterpart. The World's Fair had unknowingly returned to its original plan, a showcase of the Western world. As their exhibit, the World of Tomorrow focused on fossil fuel electricity and automobiles instead of a cleaner nuclear power and automated public transportation that was already prevalent in the USSR. A celebration of the profit-driven boom of personalized vehicles, shining star names and personalities, all to convince us that the system, capitalism, is working. Even with Googie architecture and the United States' seeming obsession with space is deeply rooted in a constant use of resources and land. The observation deck would see an entire skyline of Seattle as if to scout for more land to take. And as the United States proved in 1969 with staking an American flag on the moon, the constant conquering of land will not stop at the stars. And that's just a brief history of this American landmark.